If you're a reader who's feeling completely stuck and you don't know what to read next, don't worry, because I've got you. So I have definitely faced this predicament many times in my journey as a reader. But ever since being on Bookstagram, I feel like I've actually come across a problem where there's almost too many recommendations, or it's very difficult to condense the list. And for me, sometimes I end up with too many books on my list, or I don't really know which recommendations to trust anymore. But I'm going to break these down into categories for you, so you can kind of book shop based on genre and length of the book, or the kind of vibe, for lack of a better word. Also, I am only going to recommend books that I've actually read myself, because I do not feel comfortable recommending books that I haven't read, because who knows what I'm missing in those pages. I want to start this one off with one of my favorite authors, and definitely my favorite nonfiction author. And her name is Shauna Niequist, and I have 2 of her books here. These are the only 2 that I have actually read so far, but they're fantastic. I would read anything written by her. I've heard the term auto-buy authors going around, and she would definitely be one of those for me. I would buy anything she's written, I would read anything she's written. She's just a fantastic author. And fun fact, she actually went to the same undergraduate college that I went to, which is kind of a fun claim to fame. I think I first encountered her at my friend's house years and years ago when I was staying with her family. And this is the first book that I ever read by her. And it's just a beautiful, super engaging book about food and community, and it's almost like if you were reading a recipe blog, but you actually wanted to read all of the little stories that you have to scroll through before getting to the recipe. And there are recipes included with each chapter. So each chapter is kind of a little anecdote with a recipe attached at the end, and usually the anecdotes are, you know, connected somehow to each recipe. So I would start here if you're interested in that. And then the second book I read of hers is called Cold Tangerines. It's a very similar concept, and she really loves food. She's very passionate about food. So I feel like I really connect with her about that specifically. And especially just, she has so many beautiful stories about food and how it's so essential to building community, and how it becomes a really emotional and very like sensory thing. So Cold Tangerines does not have recipes included, but it's also a fantastic read. So I don't have physical copies of these next ones, but one of them is called Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom, and it's actually a memoir from Corrie ten Boom, who was a woman living in Holland during World War II and during the time when Holland was invaded by Germany. And she was a watchmaker's daughter, and her memoir is the story of her and her family during this time, all of the different things that they went through. And it's a really poignant, really dark, honestly, but very hopeful memoir, and it's very emotional, very difficult to get through, but I would recommend this to just about anybody. Starting off with one of my favorite books of all time, Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. And I really don't want to say too much about this one at all, because I feel like you should kind of go into it with zero expectations, just knowing that this is like one of the best books ever. And it's a little bit difficult to get into at first, just because, I mean, it wasn't for me, but I've heard that from some people, because you're kind of launched into this world not knowing anything at all, and you're kind of along for the ride and going on this journey with the main character, and all of these threads are kind of unraveling slowly over the course of the book. For me, when I read it, my mind was just blown so many different times. I won't say anything else about this, but you can read the back, you You can read the blurb, and do not go searching for spoilers because you'll ruin it for yourself. But this is just fantastic. I can't recommend this one enough. It's 245 pages, so it's not terribly long, and I think you'll probably just breeze through this. The next one in this category is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, and I've heard a lot of mixed opinions on this book, but I'm a pretty big fan of it. I really enjoyed it when I read it. The funny thing is, I read it, I think, right after the pandemic, which was really interesting because this is about a pandemic, but it's about a much more destructive one where I think over 50% of the population is eradicated by this mysterious virus, and this book is about the aftermath. And there's kind of this mystery that's woven throughout the story, but it's just really beautifully written, and again, it's a pretty standard novel length. It's about 330 pages or so, but I just felt super compelled by the characters and the story, mostly the story, honestly, and the world that this story is happening in. And it's a really interesting look at how humanity adapts to certain life-altering events, how there are people who strive to keep music and art and all of the beautiful things in the world accessible, and I would really recommend it. So the next one I would recommend is called The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, and I read this one on my Kindle. I don't know if it would really be speculative fiction, but that's the best place I can think to put it. It definitely has some elements of magical realism and fantasy and even a little bit of historical fiction. But I feel like magical realism and speculative fiction are the best ways to classify this one. And it's about these two people who are kind of pitted against each other in this competition from a very young age, but they don't really know anything about the other person. And they both become a part of this magical traveling circus called the Night Circus. And this circus just kind of pops up out of nowhere. There doesn't seem to be any sort of rhyme or reason to it. It's all very mysterious and very whimsical, very descriptive, and I wouldn't call this one of the best books ever, but I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and it actually got me out of a reading slump that I was in towards the end of last year, so highly recommend. I would say it's a page turner for sure. All right, and my last one in this category is Farenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and this is kind of apocalyptic fiction. It's definitely a warning from Ray Bradbury to society to not fall into these traps and pitfalls that are highlighted in the story. And it's about this man named Guy Montag, and he's a fireman, but in this world, firemen do not fight fires, they actually burn books. And this is a world where art, literature, television, media are highly monitored, highly censored, and people only have access to a certain amount of information and art. And sort of the inciting incident of this story is when Guy meets this young woman who opens up his world and kind of reminds him to slow down and actually observe the world he's in and to step back. So I feel like this is just a very timely and poignant piece of work. I feel like it always has been though, and it's definitely a page turner. It's very short. It's under 200 pages. It's about 160 pages actually. So it's a very quick read, and I think everyone should read this book. One of my favorite books of all time is The Scarlet Pimpernel by Baroness Orczy. I hope I'm saying her name right, but this is, it's just like the most delightful piece of literature that's out there. This is a fiction piece written in around 1910, I want to say, but it takes place in 1792 when the French Revolution is at its height and aristocrats in Paris are being gathered up and sent to the guillotine. But there's a British aristocrat known as Sir Percival Blakeney, who is like the best character ever written. And there's this mysterious figure known as the Scarlet Pimpernel who actually goes into Paris in disguise and rescues these French aristocrats from the guillotine. And this woman who is known as the brightest and most fashionable and the highest socialite of Paris, Marguerite, is drawn to Sir Percival Blakeney. And this book is just so delightful, and I love it so much that I feel like I can't even give you an accurate description of this book. So, as the blurb notes, the mysterious figure known as the Scarlet Pimpernel, sworn to rescue helpless men, women, and children from their doom, his implacable foe, the French agent Chauvelin, relentlessly hunting him down, and lovely Marguerite Blakeney, a beautiful French exile married to an English lord and caught in a terrible conflict of loyalties, all play their parts in a suspenseful tale that ranges from the squalid slums of Paris to the aristocratic salons of London, from intrigue on a great English country estate to the final denouement on the cliffs of the French coast. If you know what's good for you, go read it. Another book I absolutely adore and has a very special place in my heart is the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Mary Ann Shaffer and Annie Barrows. You might have heard about the Netflix movie adaptation of this book, which I also personally really love, but doesn't get quite into the depths of this story like the book does, which is basically always the case in my opinion, with the exception of the 1982 film of The Scarlet Pimpernel, because that is actually my favorite movie of all time. And you should go read this book first and then go watch the film at super low quality on YouTube for free, because that's the only way to do it. Anyways, in this book, it is January 1946, and writer Juliet Ashton receives a letter from a stranger, a founding member of the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, and so begins a remarkable tale of the island of Guernsey during the German occupation, and of a society as extraordinary as its name. Another gorgeous, gorgeous book. It's structured so that the chapters are letters, so if you like that sort of thing, you will love this. If that's not your cup of tea, you probably won't enjoy it that much, but the story is still so beautiful that I think it's worth the read. Alright, this is another one on my list for historical fiction. It is called The Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet by Jamie Ford. I have not read this one in quite a while. It was actually assigned reading during my time as an English major in school. It takes place in 1986 during the Japanese internment camps in America. And it's described kind of as written by the Seattle Times, a wartime era Chinese-Japanese variation on Romeo and Juliet. The period detail is so revealing and so well rendered. I think this is another, I keep saying beautifully written book, but it's just gorgeous. And I think it's another very timely and poignant piece of work, and it's also just a really lovely story. Okay, the last historical fiction book on my list is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, and I do not have a copy of this one with me, but it's just like the most gorgeous book. It's almost more like poetry than prose, the way it's written. Again, it's a World War II historical fiction, which I tend to read a pretty good deal of. My first recommendation is actually a series of 7 books, which are all pretty short, and if you haven't guessed already, it is The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And I am actually about to go into a reread of this entire series, hopefully next month, because I haven't actually finished reading the entire series, which I feel like is kind of sad for an English major graduate. These books are just fantastic. Obviously, I love C.S. Lewis. I'm a big fan of his work and his writing, and I think those of us who are familiar with classics and literature are very aware that the most popular or most well-known book in the series is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you've probably seen the movie adaptation from the early 2000s at some point in your life, but the entire series covers quite a few different characters and quite a few different storylines, and One of the reasons I am rereading the series and actually finishing the series is because I can't remember what half of those storylines actually are. But I do know that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was my favorite book as a kid, and as I grew up, Prince Caspian and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader became my other favorites. So I'm very much looking forward to rereading those and to actually finishing the series, because I have not read the last two, which are The Silver Chair and The Last Battle. Okay, the next one on my list is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, and oh my gosh, I had not really heard of this book until Netflix came out with their TV show, which is called Shadow and Bone, derived from the main trilogy, Shadow and Bone. And at this point, I have read that trilogy as well as the Six of Crows duology, and Shadow and Bone was fine. It didn't feel like anything super special to me, aside from really unique elements of world building, but I just thought it was fine. And I ended up reading Six of Crows, and I was like, whoa, where has this been my whole life? I know I would have loved this as a teenager, because it is technically in the YA category. But honestly, some of the things that happen in this book are a little more like new adult than young adult. But I love the characters in this book, and I think the plot is just fantastic. The world building's fantastic. Every time you think something's going to completely go down the drain, or you're totally caught off guard by something, it turns out, oh, this has been the plan all along, and you're just astounded at every turn at what Casbrecker has up his sleeve. And you're also just rooting for certain characters the entire time. I just love that one. It is a decently thick book, but I would classify it as a page turner. All right, another page turner in the stack is Uprooted by Naomi Novik, and I know this one's been going around Instagram a little bit here and there, but my husband and I actually listened to this one on audiobook when we were driving down to Phoenix to see a friend back in January. But this is a pretty fantastic read, and I will just read you the back to give you a little overview. Agnieszka loves her valley home in a quiet village, but the corrupted wood stands on the border, full of malevolent power, and its shadow lies over her life. Her people rely on the cold-driven wizard, known only as the dragon, to keep the wood's dark forces at bay, but he demands a terrible price for his assistance. Every 10 years, one young woman must be handed over to serve him without question. So of course, our main character, Agnieszka, is the young girl from the village who is chosen to go with the dragon, and all of these wild events begin to unfold. And I do have to say, if you are of the faint of heart, if you are squeamish, and if you have a low tolerance for violence, this book is not for you at all. And I personally barely made it through this. I think the story was really great, and I was super interested in the characters and the way the wood is a villain itself, and also the way that the story ends is very unexpected and very beautiful in its own way. But there was a lot of violence, and I have a pretty low tolerance for that. So I think I only made it through the whole book because we were listening to it on audiobook together and kind of following along in here. All right, the last one in my fantasy category for now is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Faeries. And I'm not like a fairy girl. I do not usually read things like this, but I kept seeing this one Instagrammer post about it, and I was just so fascinated by it. And so I kind of bought it impulsively, and I was like, yeah, I just need like a really cozy fantasy read right now. And this definitely lived up to my expectations and to the hype that this Instagrammer was building for it. And I'm actually not finished with it yet, but I am about halfway through. It's just lovely so far. It's about this adorable, socially awkward scientist, introverted fairy expert, who is a scholar in the 1910s. It has a few elements of like magical realism to it, but it's definitely more fantastical, and it follows this scientist on her journey kind of into the north, like northern Scandinavian territories, and she's searching for some revelatory information and, you know, taking samples, doing field work. Her only friend from the university shows up out of the blue and is kind of piggybacking on her expedition. The story kind of morphs into a story about the two of them and their research together. And I really can't give you any more than that right now because I'm only halfway through, so.